The morning of November the 22nd, 1718, began the way most mornings did in the shallow waters off Ocracoke Island, quiet, gray, and still. Two small British naval sloops, the Jane and the Ranger, had been anchored in the channel through the night, waiting. Their commander, Lieutenant Robert Maynard of the Royal Navy, had ordered his men to sleep below decks so the larger vessel anchored nearby would think them undermanned. The larger vessel was the Adventure, and aboard the Adventure was the most feared pirate in the Atlantic world. Edward Teach, known to everyone who ever crossed him as Blackbeard, had been drinking rum and singing with his crew since sundown. His lookouts had spotted the British sloops hours earlier. His crew numbered around 19 men. Maynard's force numbered around 60. Blackbeard had fought his way out of worse odds than this, and he knew these waters better than any Royal Navy officer alive. He decided to fight. What happened at dawn has been reconstructed from court depositions, survivor accounts, and the official log of Lieutenant Maynard. Blackbeard's crew opened fire first, killing or wounding 2/3 of Maynard's men with a single broadside. The Ranger was temporarily knocked out of the fight. Maynard ordered his surviving crew below decks and steered the Jane directly into the side of the Adventure. When Blackbeard's men boarded what looked like an almost empty ship, Maynard's sailors poured up through the hatches. The fight lasted less than 10 minutes. Blackbeard was shot 5 times and stabbed more than 20 times before he stopped. According to Boston News letter accounts published weeks later, he was still swinging his cutlass when he died. Maynard cut off his head and hung it from the bowsprit for the sail back to Bath. It was a deliberate choice. An empire was sending a message. That message wasn't just for the pirates, it was for everyone watching. Because what ended in that shallow channel off Ocracoke wasn't just one man's life. It was the end of something that had taken nearly 3 decades to build. An entire civilization built by men and women who had decided that the ocean belonged to no king and no company. An experiment in freedom so radical that the governments of Europe couldn't afford to let it survive. This is how empires ended the Golden Age of Piracy. To understand what the British Crown was so desperate to destroy, you have to understand what they had allowed to grow. The Golden Age didn't begin with Blackbeard. It began with the wreckage of 2 wars. The War of the Grand Alliance ended in 1697. The War of the Spanish Succession ended in 1714. Between them, these 2 conflicts had employed hundreds of thousands of sailors, privateers, and naval volunteers across the Caribbean, the Atlantic, and the Indian Ocean. Privateers were legal pirates. Men issued government licenses called letters of marque to attack enemy shipping in wartime. They were good at their work. Then the wars ended, and the licenses expired. In 1714 alone, an estimated 2,500 British privateers found themselves unemployed overnight. The Royal Navy demobilized tens of thousands more. These were men who knew how to sail, how to fight, and how to navigate. They did not know how to farm. They did not know how to keep books. The legal economy of the early 18th century had no particular use for them, but the illegal economy did. Within 4 years, piracy in the Caribbean and along the American coast had exploded into a full crisis. Merchants in Boston, New York, and London were documenting losses in the tens of thousands of pounds. Insurance rates on Atlantic shipping tripled. Colonial governors were writing urgent letters to the Board of Trade describing a situation that had moved beyond the control of local authorities. The pirates were not merely stealing, they were creating an alternative society. Nassau was the center of it. The Bahamas in 1713 were a British territory in name only. The islands had no functioning government, no garrison, no reliable courts. What they had was a deep harbor on New Providence, a location that sat directly athwart the shipping lanes between Europe and the Caribbean, and an existing population of sailors, wreckers, and former privateers who wanted nothing to do with any empire. By 1714, Nassau's harbor was full of captured vessels being stripped for parts and sold. By 1716, an estimated 500 to 1,000 pirates called New Providence their home port. They called themselves the Flying Gang. The name matters less than what they built. Nassau in those years operated as a functioning town with a population, a local economy, and a social structure that governed itself without any reference to kings or parliaments. Prizes were divided by vote among the crew. Captains could be removed by majority decision. A sailor who lost a hand in battle received a set payment from the communal fund before any shares were distributed. The sick and the old were maintained by the same fund. This wasn't democracy in the modern sense, but it was closer to democracy than anything the men who built it had ever experienced under the flag of any nation. The man at the center of this world was Benjamin Hornigold, not Blackbeard, not Bartholomew Roberts. Hornigold. He was older, steadier, and smarter than most of the men around him, and he understood instinctively that Nassau needed a structure to survive. He mentored a generation of pirates who would become the figures history remembers. Blackbeard sailed with him. Charles Vane sailed with him. Samuel Bellamy, before he went north and drowned off Cape Cod with his treasure in 1717, learned from him. Hornigold built the Republic of Pirates, and then Hornigold took the king's pardon and became a pirate hunter. This is the detail that explains everything about how the Golden Age ended. It didn't end only because empires sent navies. It ended because empires were patient, and they knew that something built by men was built with men's weaknesses. Self-interest, fear, the desire for a safe harbor after years at sea. King George I issued the first proclamation of grace on September 5, 1717. The document offered a full pardon to any pirate who surrendered to a colonial governor before September 5, 1718. The terms were clear. Surrender, swear an oath, and the crown would forget what you had done. Keep sailing, and the crown would hunt you down and hang you. The offer was genuine. The deadline was real. The man chosen to deliver that offer to Nassau was Woodes Rogers. He was a privateer captain turned merchant, a man who had circumnavigated the globe between 1708 and 1711 and rescued Alexander Selkirk from an uninhabited island off Chile along the way. Selkirk's story would become Robinson Crusoe 4 years later, which tells you something about the circles Rogers moved in. He was tenacious, practical, and completely ruthless when the situation required it. He was also broke. Rogers took the appointment as governor of the Bahamas in exchange for the salary and the chance to rebuild his finances. He arrived at Nassau on July 11, 1718, with 2 Royal Navy frigates, a company of soldiers, and the King's proclamation. What he found when he sailed into Nassau Harbor was less than half of what the Republic had been. News of the pardon had circulated for months, and it had done exactly what the Crown intended. It had fractured the flying gang. Hornigold had already surrendered. Bellamy was dead. Charles Vane, who was one of the hardest men in the Caribbean and who distrusted every crown on earth, sailed his sloop out through the back channel as Rogers sailed in through the front, firing his guns in contempt as he left. Most of the pirates on New Providence accepted the pardon. Around 600 men took the oath. Rogers organized them into a militia, repaired the fortifications, and started the long and unglamorous work of turning a pirate haven into a functioning British colony. Many of the men who accepted the pardon struggled with the transition. The wages Rogers could pay were a fraction of what a good prize had been worth. Several men returned to piracy within months, which Rogers handled by hanging them. He wasn't sentimental about it. The Republic was over. But the Republic's most famous graduates had not been in Nassau to accept the pardon. Blackbeard had been operating along the American coast for most of 1718. By the time Rogers arrived in Nassau, Blackbeard had made himself the most publicized pirate in the Atlantic world, which was partly deliberate. He understood that reputation was a weapon. He wore slow-burning matches in his beard during battle so that his face was wreathed in smoke, a calculated piece of theater designed to make men surrender without a fight. It usually worked. The records suggest Blackbeard was a far more capable and less violent man than his reputation implied. He rarely killed anyone who didn't force the issue. He preferred surrender because surrender was faster and less dangerous than a real battle. Reputation alone couldn't protect him from what was coming. In May 1718, Blackbeard blockaded the entire port of Charlestown, South Carolina, for nearly a week. He captured 9 vessels, held prominent citizens for ransom, and demanded a chest of medicine from the Colonial Assembly as the price for leaving. He got the medicine and the ransom. and he made a permanent enemy of Charlestown's merchant class, men with connections to London. He then accepted the pardon himself in June 1718 from the governor of North Carolina, a man named Charles Eden, who was by most contemporary accounts either tolerant of pirates or actively in business with them. Blackbeard settled briefly in Bath, bought a house, reportedly married a local woman, and appeared to be done. He was not done. By the fall of 1718, Blackbeard was sailing again, and Virginia's governor, Alexander Spotswood, had had enough. Spotswood had no authority over North Carolina's waters. He sent Maynard anyway, funding the expedition initially out of his own pocket and claiming the expense back from the crown later. The message from Ocracoke, with Blackbeard's head hung from the bowsprit, reached Spotswood in December 1718. In Charlestown that same month, Stata Bonnet was hanged. Bonnet was a wealthy Barbados plantation owner who had gone to sea for reasons that contemporary accounts describe with remarkable consistency as an escape from an unhappy marriage. He had no sailing experience when he began. He hired a crew, bought a vessel he named the Revenge, and sailed into piracy as a gentleman's hobby, which is not a career choice the ocean respects. He fell in with Blackbeard, who took command of Bonnet's ship for a period on the grounds, apparently reasonable ones, that Bonnet had no idea what he was doing. After accepting the pardon and then returning to piracy, Bonnet was captured by a Royal Navy force off Cape Fear. He was tried in Charlestown, he wept in court, and begged for his life. The judge was unmoved. They hanged him on December 10, 1718, along with 29 of his crew. The executions of 1718 were not the end of the Golden Age. They were the announcement of the end. Charles Vane, the man who had fired his guns at Woodes Rogers and sailed out of Nassau, rather than take any pardon, continued operating for another year and a half. He was eventually shipwrecked on an uninhabited island, rescued by a passing vessel, recognized by a former pirate who was now living legally, and turned in. Jamaica hanged him in 1720. Calico Jack Rackham, who had served under Vane and then taken a pardon and then returned to sea, was captured in October 1720 by a force authorized by Jamaica's Governor Laws. Rackham and most of his male crew were drunk when the attack came. 2 members of his crew fought back. Both of them were women. Anne Bonny and Mary Read are the detail that no account of the end of the Golden Age can ignore, because they refuse to be reduced to a footnote. Both had been living as pirates on Rackham's crew for months. Both fought when the men around them didn't. At Rackham's trial, Bonny told him, according to contemporary accounts, that she was sorry to see him there, but that if he had fought like a man, he need not have been hanged like a dog. Rackham was hanged in November 1720 at Port Royal. His body was displayed in a cage at a point of land at the entrance to the harbor, which is still called Rackham's Cay. Bonny and Read were both convicted but pleaded pregnancy, which spared them immediate execution. Mary Read died in prison, probably of fever, in April 1721. What became of Anne Bonny is not recorded. She simply disappears from the historical record. The gap where Anne Bonny should be is one of those silences that history leaves deliberately vague or genuinely doesn't know. What is not vague is what was happening to piracy as a whole by 1721. The Royal Navy had been reorganized. The Admiralty courts in the colonies had been given expanded authority to try pirates without sending them to London. The Piracy Act of 1700 and its successors made it faster and cheaper to hang pirates where you caught them. The amnesty had split the pirate community between those who had accepted pardons and those who hadn't, and the ones who had accepted pardons often became the most effective pirate hunters because they knew exactly where to look. The last great pirate of the Golden Age was Bartholomew Roberts, and he went down fighting. Roberts, known as Black Bart, had not been a willing pirate to begin with. He was taken from a slave trading vessel called the Princess in 1719 by the crew of Howell Davis, another pirate captain. Roberts was a skilled navigator, which made him valuable. He was pressed into service. Davis was killed in a Portuguese ambush 6 weeks later, and Roberts was elected captain by the crew. He accepted. What Roberts built over the next 3 years was the largest and most successful pirate operation in the history of the Atlantic world. He captured an estimated 400 vessels, At his peak, he commanded a fleet of 4 ships and several hundred men, which put him on roughly equal footing with the naval forces most colonial governors could muster against him. He operated from Brazil to West Africa, to the Caribbean, to Newfoundland. He wrote his own code of conduct for his ships, a detailed document governing the distribution of shares, the treatment of prisoners, the compensation of the injured, and the resolution of disputes among crew members. He famously outlawed women aboard his ships, not from Puritanism, but from his cold assessment of what women caused among men who had been at sea for months. He outlawed gambling for the same reason. He ran his ships the way a military commander runs a fleet, with discipline, with purpose, and with a clarity that most of his contemporaries lacked. He also had no illusions about what he was doing. Roberts' own words, recorded in various accounts including Captain Charles Johnson's 1724 history, express a kind of resigned contempt for the life he found himself living. He is quoted as saying that a merry life and a short one shall be his motto, which doesn't sound like a man in love with his profession. It sounds like a man who made a choice and sees its consequences clearly. The Royal Navy's campaign against Roberts was methodical. Captain Challoner Ogle in the HMS Swallow was assigned to the West African coast, where Roberts had been operating for months. On February 10, 1722, Ogle found Roberts's fleet anchored off Cape Lopez on the coast of what is now Gabon. Roberts' ships were the Royal Fortune and 2 consort vessels. Many of Roberts's men were drunk from a celebration the night before. Ogle used the same deception Maynard had used against Blackbeard. The Swallow initially appeared to be a merchant vessel, or at least something less threatening than a Royal Navy warship. By the time Roberts's lookouts assessed the situation correctly, Ogle was close enough to engage. Roberts himself was killed in the first broadside. A grape-shot round struck him in the throat. His crew, following his standing instructions, threw his body overboard rather than let the Royal Navy take it. The rest of his crew surrendered. The trial that followed at Cape Coast Castle in what is now Ghana was the largest piracy trial in the history of the British Empire. 262 men were tried. Of those, 52 were hanged. 37 were sentenced to hard labor in the gold mines on the African coast. The rest were acquitted or transported. The trials were conducted quickly and efficiently because efficiency was now the point. The Crown was not making an example anymore. The Crown was cleaning up. Historians mark 1726 as the conventional end of the Golden Age of Piracy. That date corresponds roughly to the execution of William Fly, a man who went to the gallows in Boston, refusing to admit any wrongdoing and apparently lecturing the ship's captain, whose brutal treatment of sailors had driven him to mutiny in the first place. Fly was hanged and his body was displayed in a cage on an island in Boston Harbor. Cotton Mather, who had been at the scaffold, wrote about it. The details were published. It was a public health measure as much as a punishment, the way a city might post warnings about contaminated water. But the question worth sitting with isn't when the Golden Age ended. The question is what it actually was and what its end actually meant. The pirates of the Golden Age were not heroes in any simple sense. They were violent men operating a violent business. They terrorized merchant sailors, held innocent passengers for ransom, and left a trail of economic destruction across 3 oceans. The fact that many of them had been driven to piracy by a system that treated sailors as expendable doesn't transform their acts into justice. But the world they built at Nassau, and the codes they wrote for their ships, and the votes they held before every major decision tell a different story alongside the violence. They were men who had experienced directly what it meant to have no power in a world organized entirely around power. The merchant marine of the early 18th century was brutal. Sailors could be flogged at the captain's discretion. They could be held on board against their will under laws that effectively made them property for the duration of a voyage. Their pay was frequently withheld. Their food was frequently rotten. If they died at sea, their families received nothing. The pirates had experienced all of this, and they built something in opposition to all of it. The opposition was also brutal and often unjust. But it was theirs. The governments that destroyed it were not simply enforcing law and order. They were protecting commerce. The distinction matters. The merchants of London and Boston and Bristol, who lobbied for expanded admiralty courts and funded pirate hunting expeditions, were not primarily concerned with the suffering of the sailors the pirates attacked. They were concerned with the insurance rates and the interrupted supply of goods and the disruption of a trading system that made them wealthy. The law was their instrument, and they used it. And so the Royal Navy was reorganized, the pardons were offered and then retracted, the trials were made faster and cheaper, and one by one, the men and women who had built an alternative to the world they had been born into were hunted down and killed. Blackbeard's head on a bowsprit, Vane in a cage above a harbor, Rackham swinging at the entrance to Port Royal. The last witnesses to the Golden Age were the ordinary sailors of the 1720s and 1730s, men who had grown up hearing stories about Nassau and the flying gang and Roberts and his 400 prizes. They carried those stories into the legitimate maritime world, which is possibly why conditions for ordinary sailors began, slowly and incompletely, to improve in the decades after 1726. Whether the improvement was connected to the example the pirates had set is something historians debate without resolution. The evidence is circumstantial, the timing is suggestive. What is not debated is that the Golden Age is gone, and the surviving records only preserve fragments of what it actually was. The trial transcripts survive. The newspaper accounts survive. Captain Johnson's history, published in 1724, survives and contains most of what we think we know about men like Roberts and Blackbeard and Calico Jack. But Johnson's real identity is still disputed by scholars, his sources remain unclear, and some of what he wrote was almost certainly shaped for a popular audience that wanted drama more than it wanted accuracy. The voices of the ordinary pirates don't survive. The sailor who voted to elect Roberts captain after Davis was killed. The woman who fought on Rackham's ship when the men around her didn't. The formerly enslaved men who made up an estimated 30% of pirate crews in the Caribbean and who found in piracy the only form of liberty available to them in the early 18th century. Those voices are gone. What remains is the outline. 30 years of a world the empires didn't authorize. A harbor in the Bahamas where the rules were made by vote. Ships where the injured were compensated before anyone else was paid. A woman whose last recorded words to the man she loved were that he should have fought better. And then the Royal Navy and the trials and the bodies in the cages above the harbors and the long silence of an ocean that went back to belonging to kings and companies. The sea remembers nothing, but the archives preserve what the sea forgot. And somewhere in those trial records from Cape Coast Castle, in the careful handwriting of Crown officials recording the testimony of men who would be hanged within the week, there are voices insisting, even at the very end, that what they built was worth building. That the short life they chose was better than the long one they were offered. Voices that died in chains, convinced they had once been free. The empires won. They always win eventually. But they won against something real, and understanding what they won against is the only way to understand what was actually lost when the last pirate ship was boarded, the last great captain's body went over the side, and the Golden Age of Piracy became history.